Hello, everybody. Hope you are doing okay wherever you are. Happy Tuesday. So today, first of all, the response papers due Friday, and you should be able to see on Twin now the thing on the left side of the Twin page that will tell you that's where you turn it in. So hopefully that's not a problem. If for some reason you're having a problem, then you can just email it to me. I'd prefer to be able to get it through there, but because I'll lose it in my email somewhere. But if you are having problems, then just send it along just by Friday. Also, I thought there was something else from a housekeeping standpoint that I wanted to mention. No, I'll think of it maybe. If not, I'll send you guys an email. So today is, I hope you guys are buying into what I'm pitching this course as being, and really what these 5 weeks have been, which is this really detailed case study that's tracing this cycle of a process that began with how a system of legalized segregation was created, how it was confronted, how it was toppled, how implementation of the sort of remedy has been unfolding. And then really today, what we're going to see is the sort of cycle getting to its end point, which is the legalized recreation of a system in a different form. Okay. And from there, the process continues anew, right? So after Jenkins, you are back in a world where essentially separation and inequality are both okay, and legally. They've been legally blessed again. And so it puts people right back, for the last 25 years and really longer, but confronting that system again. And while I think this is, obviously I think this particular narrative is really interesting, I want you to see it as an exemplar of a broader narrative of law and social change. And so our level of detail on this is, on some level about learning this particular narrative. But really what I'm trying to expose, because the truth of the matter is this narrative, more than any other law and social change narrative, has worked its way through courts. Now, there's been plenty of other social changes in our nation's history, but very few, and I would say none, have had the level of connection to the court system and to the work of litigators than this particular one has. And so that's why we're going into this level of detail on this subject matter. And again, as we, starting next week, start to break out of this and apply in other education contexts, I hope that you'll continue to see this, not just the cycle, but the arguments used throughout this narrative pop up over and over and over again in those contexts. So let's get through Milliken and Jenkins today. They're both hugely important and complicated and interesting cases. And so it's a lot to put in one class, but I think we can do it. And I'm going to do my best to get us there. And then I'll evaluate, maybe this was the other housekeeping business. I'll evaluate what we'll do on Friday once I know how far we got today. So stop talking and start teaching. So we have two cases. They're separated by 20 years. And it's important to sort of recognize that Jenkins unfolds in the 1990s. It is really the tail end of the Brown story. If Brown started with really the Roberts case, and if not Roberts, then at least Plessy. 100 years later, 100 years after Plessy is Jenkins, and that's really the end of this cycle of the narrative. But it's important to recognize that Jenkins doesn't happen in 1995 without Milliken happening in 1974. And I want to just put up here, as we talk about Milliken first, it really kind of surprised me that I could not find like a really good graphic that demonstrated what the school districts in the Detroit metro area look like. And so I had to like cobble together from 3 different maps because the Detroit metro area is multiple counties. 3 different maps, the various school districts involved here. And so I just want to begin with this so that you guys can kind of visualize what's going on. So this right here, this is like the geographically largest area is the Detroit school system. Okay, and really all of this is Metro Detroit, and Metro Detroit might actually even go beyond these 3 counties. But so we've got this school district, which is geographically the largest, but maybe more importantly, numerically the largest. So the density in this part of Detroit is much, much higher than as you get further and further out from the central city area. So, student population in this district that, equals basically the student population in all these other districts around it, okay? And so we have one really large geographically, but even more so student population district surrounded by, and I haven't counted these, but in the court they're talking about 85 smaller school districts that are surrounding Detroit. And you can see a couple right here that are actually within the Detroit, they're swallowed by the Detroit district as well. And so some of these are very small, and you can see their lines are, kind of jagged until you get further out from the district to these larger school districts, independent school districts that exist within a county. So this is all one county, like this one right here, that's all one county, and that's one county, and that's one county. And so they have all these school districts within these counties. And so it's very, very, very different than what one would be familiar with in Tennessee or in most southern states. But this is somewhat the norm in the Midwest and Northeast. And each of these districts can tax and only serves students within the district line. So going back to our sort of initial situation, our initial sort of lecture on district autonomy and district makeup. So there's a school board for each one of these districts. There's a superintendent for each one of these districts. And they have all of the responsibility for the students within their boundaries and none of the responsibility for the students beyond their boundaries. So that's Professor Shavzin texting me in the middle of class. D. Shavzin. So that's what's going on in Detroit. And so the problem that the court is facing, and just, I guess let me back up real quick. In Milliken, we don't have, in Detroit, we don't have a situation like you would have had in Memphis or like you had in Charlotte or like you had in Topeka, where we have de jure racially segregated schools, okay? And so the initial case in Detroit is already a little bit different. It's a little bit different in the sense that there was never a law that said black students go to these schools and white students go to those schools in the same way that that existed, sort of by state constitution in other places. However, after the mid-1960s, desegregation or segregation starts to be defined in a somewhat more expansive way, and Detroit was found to have segregated its schools, so to be making intentional decisions that resulted in racial separation of students. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind here is that we're already outside of the South. And a lot of people will say that the resistance to desegregation doesn't pick up like in terms of winning cases at the Supreme Court level, like Milliken is a win for the resistors of desegregation, doesn't actually start winning until desegregation starts happening outside of the South. So long as it was just a Southern problem, then it was win after win after win after win. But as soon as it became a non-Southern problem, or beyond a Southern problem, then all of a sudden the government, the enthusiasm for desegregation starts to back off. And so some of you who might maybe rightfully have a Southern chip on your shoulder about sort of maybe Northerners thinking that all the racial problems are in the South, when in reality that's clearly not true. That might fit that way of thinking. This fact that once desegregation starts exiting the South and existing in other places, that's when the tide turns against desegregation. So that's just a side note. So what happens after they have the finding in this district, Detroit, the pink one right here? They need a desegregation plan. And what they've got is a situation like after Swan that says, okay, you don't need to have every school in the district reflect the racial makeup of the district. And it's okay to have some single race schools so long as you're making a good faith effort towards desegregation. But you can bus students. And the district court in Detroit is looking at that geography, looking at that map and looking at the numbers and saying, we can't do this. Like, this can't be done. What we're looking at is a Detroit district that is increasingly already becoming predominantly an African-American school district. Not just that there are African-American schools in Detroit, but that it is a predominantly African-American school district, and increasingly so. And what the district court says is, well, if my charge is to eliminate the vestiges of state-sponsored segregation, well, then one of those vestiges is that this is a majority Black district, and these, all 85 of them, are, with I think like there's 2 exceptions, are almost exclusively white. And so the district court looks at this and says, well, that seems like a vestige of state-sponsored segregation or state-enabled segregation. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to capture all of these school districts in my plan and essentially order busing across district lines. So this is generally called a metropolitan desegregation plan. And I want to note that in some places, states or adjacent school districts voluntarily participated in or created metropolitan school desegregation plans. And those actually still exist. What's happening in Detroit is a little bit different because it's going to be a court-ordered metropolitan desegregation. And so the question that the court is going to get is about the limits of the court power to order that. So just like in Swan, where the court said, no, the local district courts don't have the authority to order every school district to be racially reflective. So, but if a school district wants that, then they're entitled to do it. So too here, the court is saying, local district courts, can they have metropolitan deseg plans? Do they have that authority? Which is a different question from, could a state, like could Detroit and all these districts get together and say, hey, we want to have a metro deseg plan or a metro diversity plan or something like that. So I just want to separate out that, this question is an authority of the court question, not in the local district court really question, not a what could a district or districts voluntarily do. And so if this is a vestige, the racial identifiability of school districts is a vestige, then the district court is thinking, well, we can just bus across district lines. And so what they were essentially going to have happen was they were going to pair areas within Detroit with school districts, with other school districts, and bus students from the outlying school district into the Detroit schools while busing Detroit students out to the outlying school, the suburban school. And so they would have done this. I think the plan involved something like the elementary school students would bus in one direction and the middle and high school students would bus in the other direction. So there would be a pairing and a age-based or grade-based busing program that was going in both directions. That was the idea. It was never implemented because the case goes the way it goes. And so I've already identified this, but I just want to make it explicit. What vestige is being eliminated through a metropolitan desegregation plan? The vestige is separation of students across school districts. Okay, racial identifiability of school districts. And so what I'd first like to ask you guys is, what's different about racial identifiability of school districts, which is what they're encountering in a metro deseg plan like in Milliken, versus like in Swan or Charlotte, where they're talking about racial identifiability of schools within a single district? Why, from a legal standpoint or from a practical standpoint, what is the difference? Why is Milliken different than what we have encountered before Milliken? Does that make a difference? Yeah, David, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, in this one, you have, each district is its own government entity, and some of these are in different counties even, and so as opposed to when we're looking at the other cases, they're all schools within a single district under one sort of jurisdiction, and this is going to be multi-jurisdictional. Okay,
and so what does that multi-jurisdictional, how does that complicate things?
So it's Detroit that's is sort of before the court. These other districts are not before the court right now, and so the judge is making the decision to bring them in to address the larger issues of segregation.
Great. So one issue is who is the parties to the lawsuit issue, right? Detroit has been found to be the violator, and Detroit is therefore subject to deseg remedy, but these other districts weren't part of that lawsuit in the first place, as opposed to in Charlotte, where the Charlotte district was the defendant, and all the schools in that jurisdiction were part of the lawsuit from the outset. Rachel, I saw your hand, but now it's down, so you're out. Other thoughts? What else makes this different? So David, that's kind of a legal answer, right? It's legally different because the jurisdictions are different. What about practically or politically? What's different about a inter-district situation, right? A metropolitan situation, as opposed to an intra-district like we had in Swan. What else might be different? Yeah, Chelsea.
So I would also think that just logistics, right? I mean, like getting people from, like, how are you gonna, like, if somebody is like way over here, but the school they need to go to is here. I mean, I know they talked about busing and all that stuff too, but like one kid who might live by this school and could reasonably go to the school now has to go over here because of this gigantic plan. So I mean, like logistically, it seems like a nightmare.
Right. So we have potentially physical problems here. Although I will note that counties in the South tend to be geographically pretty large as well. Detroit in particular might be problematic because it's not like a center with a bunch of spokes, right? It doesn't go in 360 degrees here. It's only going in 270 degrees, maybe around. And so Detroit might pose a particular problem for this which I guess I should also note, Kansas City would also pose a particular problem because of the state line that exists in the, if, for those of you who are familiar with Kansas City, there's, it's kind of like here where it's actually even more so than here, where there's state lines that separate. And so then you're not even just talking about different school districts, you're talking about different state law that's at play. So that's another possible problem, is there's physical difficulty in implementing this. Yeah, Taylor.
I was also, you mentioned politically and how each school district could tax and whatnot on its own. So thinking about the complications with that, then how do you allocate the money and what goes where and who actually gets the funds from that specific zone?
Great. So if I live in school district A and now my student is going to be bused into school district B, well, there's all sorts of potential issues with that. But one of the potential issues with that is that I'm not paying taxes for school district B, and a student from school district B is not paying taxes for school district A. And so it really, really complicates things. I mentioned that in Michigan, each of those school districts has its own taxing authority. They are the taxer. And so you have that kind of problem, that when you are sort of forcing students across district lines. So it's more complicated. Rachel and then Jonathan. You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I just had a question about the case. So they're talking about, how no matter how these lines are drawn, was Detroit making these were they changing them consistently throughout the years to just encourage this racial segregation, or are these old lines that had been drawn? Why was this brought up now?
Why was what brought up now?
I guess I was just trying to figure out how consistently were these lines, are these old lines that have always been in place with these school districts, or are these consistently being changed to keep racial segregation in check?
They are old lines. They were not created in the context of school desegregation. But I think it would be naive to suggest that they were not connected to the development of what I would call exclusive or exclusionary neighborhoods that are separated from Detroit proper over time. So they may have not been they were not changing. These districts, especially the closer in ones, were not created in 1955, right? They were created they predate Brown. But probably the similar motivations that would lead people to change school districts after desegregation would have led to the creation of these towns in the beginning. But you also have to remember, this is maybe more information than you're asking for. I think the answer to your question is no. They were not manipulating this in order to create that. I think that would be overstating what's going on here. They were not manipulating these school district lines to make it so that Detroit was a majority Black district and these towns were majority white districts. That was the effect, and that was probably the intent at some point, but that's not when they were first created. So if you think about, even if you're here, you think of a place like Collierville, right? At this point in time, Collierville feels like an extension of Memphis in a lot of ways, right? It's kind of like a seamless transition as you drive from Memphis through Germantown or into Collierville. But that wasn't always the case. When Collierville first came into being, Collierville was distant and there were really no roads, high quality roads that would have connected Collierville to Memphis. And so Collierville grew as a separate town from Memphis, which really was serving a separate community. And I suspect that that's a lot of the case in a lot of these places as well.
Okay, yeah, I was just, that makes sense. And I do agree 100% that like we shouldn't be naive, that this was definitely a way to keep segregation in check. I was getting confused in the case, and I'm sure we'll go over it, about them talking about inter-district like segregation and just how districts, so I just got confused with all the districting.
It's very hard, right? So they're talking about, does an intra-district violation, like was the segregation that was allowed for in Detroit or perpetuated in Detroit, is that what created ultimately the landscape that we now see? And the plaintiffs' lawyers were arguing that, yeah, like like when we put our list of vestiges up, one of the vestiges we said was racial attitudes. And racial attitudes, could be connected to the reasons why people would want to relocate out of Detroit. And I don't want to put everyone who's ever relocated out of Detroit or out of any city as saying like that their whole motivation was to avoid being associated with an increasingly African-American central city. Okay, I don't want to put that on every single person, but the trend is unmistakable that is the effect of what happened. Okay, Jonathan.
I think this is sort of has to do with what you just talked about, but it seems like the big difference between an intra-district, two schools, one is racially segregated Black, one is racially segregated white, and what was going on in Milliken is that they seem to be more concerned about that trend of, I believe the case calls it white flight, of there's no necessarily like government or school district action that's resulting in schools being segregated, but the choices of individuals to leave and go to other districts is what's creating that segregation. And that seems to create, like, it seems like it would create a much more difficult challenge to overcome than just the government saying this school's white, this school's Black.
So absolutely, right? So the individual choice element here is something that the court relies on, and they say that the causation here cannot be as clearly tied to the causation of the across district segregation cannot be as clearly connected back to state action as it could in a situation where you have Black schools and white schools, and that's where you go to school. So absolutely, it's the case that is individual choice here is muddying the waters for the plaintiffs, right? If the plaintiffs are saying this is all a vestige of state-sponsored segregation, well, that's removing choice from the individual bunch of individual choices from playing the role. So think about this. I love continuing to come back to Mr. McLaurin in his school. What Swan enables and what the district court was ordering in Milliken was forcing people to sit next to Mr. McLaurin. Okay. And in fact, if you want to take the analogy all the way out, we're going to force people to sit next to Mr. McLaurin, and those people are then going to potentially choose to go to a different school, okay? To no longer go to the University of Oklahoma, to go to Oklahoma State or something like that. And then the court is going to say, okay, well, here's what we're going to do now. We're going to include Oklahoma State in our remedy. And now people from Oklahoma State have to come and sit next to Mr. McLaurin, okay? Because the whole reason that these people are going to Oklahoma State is to avoid sitting next to Mr. McLaurin. And that's not a valid, we're rejecting that as a reason to, we think that is a perpetuation of segregation, right? That choice that they've made is a perpetuation of segregation. And that's really hard. That's a really hard argument to win, I think. And it doesn't win. It doesn't win even if it might be educationally justified, maybe morally justified, maybe reflective of the sort of real motivations of what's going on here. It's really hard to say, no matter what school you go to, you have to come and sit next to Mr. McLaurin, or, you know, people have to sit place, you know, we're going to force people to sit places. That seems to be the tension point, the fulcrum here. As long as we're at government neutrality, right? Get the government out of the way so that people can come together if they so choose. That seems to be everyone's on board with that. But as soon as you go beyond that into really remedying the problem, that's where the resistance hits. And that's where the resistance hit in this particular story. You know, once Swan comes, then, you know, we use the word a lot, effectiveness. Then effectiveness of at least undoing racial isolation in schools seems to follow next. And I think I mentioned on last class, that is exactly what happened, right? Post-Swan, the South desegregates, like more or less, you know, well, less, but more than most other places, okay? Swan really is effective. It's just, it also triggers this resistance. And ultimately the resistance is, you know, sort of we see it play out over the decades. Milliken is an example of taking Swan to its logical next step, right? Well, if desegregation within a district can be effectively undone, then why not desegregation across districts within a metropolitan area? Same idea. Let's do that effectively too. And here's where the court puts the brakes and says, no, 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 we've gone too far. Darius, did you have a hand up?
Yeah, I did at first, and I think I might have answered it because I think Jonathan said something that kind of threw me off. Because when he said white flight, I was just thinking about the other case, Missouri. But I didn't see that in the reading. But I guess that's just kind of what it is. You just look at it in some sense. But I answered my own question, so I guess not.
Okay. So you guys have identified legal difficulties, political difficulties, practical difficulties that expanding this creates that are not present in a Swan type situation. And you guys know that the ultimate outcome here is that the court says, no, 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 this is beyond the scope of what these district courts can do within a desegregation case. And I just want to identify real quick, you know, the sort of, just like we've done throughout, you know, identify the tricks or the tools that are used in order to get to this outcome. So one is this remedial scope holding in Milliken. And this goes to, I think, what David was saying, which is that the scope of the violation was segregation in Detroit. And the court says, therefore, the remedy is desegregation in Detroit. And of course, Justice Marshall says, ha, 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 what are you talking about? There can't be desegregation in Detroit. And in fact, what you're doing is accelerating the fact that there will never be desegregation in Detroit. And by the way, if y'all really want to have fun, fast forward it to the Gary B case, which we read at the very beginning of the course. It's a reflection of segregation and continued inequality in Detroit. So the Gary B case connects very closely to the Milliken case in a lot of ways. So they say, but from a legal standpoint, that's solid remedies law, right? The scope of the remedy must match the scope of the rights violation. So if it's as a tort, we don't say, oh, there was an injury to this person, and therefore we're going to create a remedy for this person plus 5 other people. That's just not what you do. Or there was an injury to this person's leg, so we're going to have the tortfeasor pay for injuries to their leg and shoulder, if the shoulder was not connected. Okay, so they're saying if you want to have an inter-district, a metropolitan remedy, you have to have a metropolitan violation, and we don't have a metropolitan violation here, therefore this is no good. So that's one thing. Another part is this individual choices, which Jonathan pointed out. Okay, the individual choices are creating the across district segregation. It's so hard sometimes to say inter and intra. So I try to say across district versus within district. So it's individual choices that is creating in across district segregation. And that's not state sponsor, right? So if the problem was state sponsorship of segregation, well, individual choices are removing the state from that process, and therefore we don't have a causation. We have a causation issue here, right? Across district segregation is a result of individual choices, at least in part, and therefore beyond the scope of what Brown was talking about, which was state-sponsored segregation. And then the last thing they utilize, or one of the other things, but the last one I'm going to focus on, is this idea of local control. Okay, and they say something like no single tradition is as, you know, let me pull it up so I don't mess it up. No single tradition in public education is more deeply rooted than local control over the operation of schools. Local autonomy has long been thought essential both to the maintenance of community concern and support for public schools and to quality of the educational process. And so let me ask you guys, how would this metropolitan remedy remove local control? Why are they elevating local control so high here? What would the metropolitan remedy do to local control? Yeah, Darius.
From my understanding, like, again, it goes back to like them pointing out that the district court was overstepping and that they're playing too many roles by being the superintendent and something else they kind of called out. They're just overdoing things. So I think by placing that power in their hands is just a reflection of overstepping, and that's not, you know, the local rule or local governance is for the local governors to handle, not for the district court.
And so let me ask you this: what is what are some of the major things that an elected school board usually does? So I think you're right. What they're saying is that this removes the power of the local school board. What kinds of decisions are being removed from the local school board?
I don't know if I recall, but like, let's say if that was the case, I'm thinking like the way funding is distributed, maybe, or maybe even accessed or requested from like state government. We'll just stop there, I guess.
Good. So funding is something that they seem to be losing a little bit of control over. What else? Others? What other decisions that locally elected school boards usually make are being supplanted in a metropolitan DSEG plan like the one that the district court had ordered? Yes, Megan.
So they also do like employment, hiring and firing. I think we also said that they control a little bit of the curriculum that is taught. Like the state makes like a recommendation, but how it actually gets handled or done is.
Okay. So the sort of day-to-day operation, is that being, Megan, is that being supplanted in a Metro DSEG plan though?
So I don't think it necessarily is. I think what I got from that little blurb, which I had underlined, was what would be the point of electing those officials if the judge is just like the local judge is just going to control it. So it took away like a voter's rights aspect of legislation.
And let's connect that real quick before I let you go to the funding point that Darius made. If it's what's the point of voting for my electors if they don't have control over things, what else might that lack if I don't control, if my locally elected people don't control what's happening in the schools, what else might I want to, if I'm just a regular old
Then why would I pay taxes?
why fund these schools, right?
Yeah,
If I don't control the schools, then why fund the schools? Now, maybe that's a selfish way to be thinking about it, but that's the idea beyond, that's the idea underneath local control, is that you increase local control because that's a way to increase local support, financial support for the schools. Okay. Rachel, you had a hand up. What else might be, I'm sorry, Heather, you had a hand up. What else might be something that the local school district is no longer controlling if we have this Metro DSEG plan?
Kind of piggybacking off of what you just said, it's not really what the school district doesn't have in control, but the people who vote for their superintendents, it's kind of unclear what the status of that is. Like, are the people you're voting for, even if they could be in control, like if they didn't, like, they're not making decisions for you because it's unclear where certain things, where they even represent. Does it make sense? Sorry if that's like.
I mean, I think it makes sense in that it's the same basic point that, like, the locally elected board is, what's the point of having the locally elected board if the court is going to override it? Caitlin, how else, or what is maybe the biggest way? Funding is a big one. What is maybe the biggest way that the court is overriding what the local elected board typically does?
I was just saying school assignment, where kids go to school.
Who goes to what school, right? It's a complete override of that really important function of the local school district that they normally have, okay? And so we've seen, like, the defer to the local trick used throughout here, and here it's popping up again as we start to back out of the idea that the charge is to come up with an effective desegregation plan. Yeah, Rachel.
I have a question about the remedial scope. I don't understand why the court all of a sudden says, you know, since this isn't affecting all school districts, we shouldn't, the remedy doesn't match, like, you know how it doesn't match the remedy. But, like, in the South, or like if there's one school or two schools that are segregating students, the Supreme Court can make a law saying all schools can't do segregation. So how come they're choosing this? How come they're allowing this to say that it doesn't match the remedy?
So let's back up. When you say that if one or two schools are segregating, then the Supreme Court can say all schools must desegregate. Can you flesh that out a little bit? I
guess I'm saying I don't understand. So, like, we have through our cases that, you know, no school, it's got to be equal. No schools can segregate anymore. And the court made that law, even though not all schools were being segregated. Not all schools were segregating. There was just lots of them, but there were a few, I guess, that weren't. But in this one, they're saying because in these districts that only certain districts are disproportionate in race, that they couldn't demand all districts.
So they could. The court does not preclude demanding that all districts desegregate. But before the court will order that, then what would like, so let's use Memphis as an example. Memphis had legalized segregation, but Brown doesn't actually affect Memphis until what happens? What do Memphians have to do in order to make Brown matter in our local community?
Desegregate?
But let's say that the school board just doesn't do that.
Challenge it?
Yeah, and how would they challenge it?
Through court?
Yeah, they're going to bring a lawsuit. So Brown versus Board of Education is about the schools in Topeka and the schools in a school district in South Carolina and the schools in a school district in Virginia and some schools in Washington, D.C. and a school district in Delaware. And it's not about any other, those 5 districts, that's it. But it makes clear that the behavior in a place like Memphis, for example, or Charlotte, is no longer permissible. But if the state doesn't do anything about that, or if the state does something like, I think we talked about the Tennessee pupil assignment law, then someone, as Renee is saying, someone has to sue, right? And so there's a lawsuit about Memphis school desegregation, and there's a lawsuit about Charlotte school desegregation, and there's a lawsuit about Louisville school desegregation, and a lawsuit about Atlanta school, and so on and so forth, Nashville, whatever. So there's all of these, and in each case, and in a lot of places it's really easy, you have to prove that they are violating the Constitution first. That's the liability phase. And then once you prove that, then you prove that the defendant, the school district that you're suing, has to remedy it. So if you win and you get a finding that Memphis has been operating segregated schools in an unconstitutional manner, then you get a remedy that says Memphis has to do X, Y, and Z in order to remedy that. What the court is saying is that that first phase, the liability phase, never happened in the suburban districts around Detroit. It happened in Detroit, but the liability question was never decided, never discussed, it was never on the table. Nobody sued any of those districts. Okay, the suit was against Detroit School District. Is that making sense? And so therefore the remedy, the court says, the remedy is just limited to Detroit.
Cool. I haven't taken remedies yet, so thank you. That clears it.
Okay. Renee?
Okay, so if in Milliken, if the initial suit, if like the NAACP had brought in people from the additional areas around Detroit to file with them, then this would have had a very different outcome.
Could have, yes.
Okay.
But then you would have to find, right? You would have to deduce evidence to make a finding that the suburban districts were also had also violated the Constitution. And so let me back up for a second, because the court talks about it as though it's all individual choices. I guess I want to push back on that a little bit. What law enables the racial dynamics of the Detroit district and the suburban districts to be as they are, racially identifiable, right? And I want to make clear, these are not segregated in the sense that the suburban places are saying no black people, right? And it's not like Detroit is saying no white people, okay? It's not explicit. And so one difficulty as we get further and further from explicit racial segregation is, the pointing of the finger becomes more and more difficult, right? You say, well, it's actually something else that is causing the racial segregation, not what used to cause the racial segregation, which was the easy stuff. Hey, we have a law that says racial segregation. Well, that's easy. You can win really easy on that. But here, we never had that. And so my question is it just a matter of de facto segregation, or are there laws that you guys can think of that actually might have made this, at least made the case that it is sanctioned by law, this dynamic of a predominantly black Detroit Central City District surrounded by predominantly or almost exclusively white Detroit suburban districts? What laws might be at play here? What laws determine these kinds of things? Chris.
Maybe a law saying just like geographic, just like you go to school by where you live. And so like if a lot of black people live like in inner city Detroit, and that's where they're going to go to school, a lot of white people live in the suburbs, that's where they're going to go to school.
Yeah, and I think it's implicit, Chris, in what you're saying, and correct me if it's not. Well, the laws created the school districts. right? And though those school districts may or may not have been created for this purpose, it is definitely the case that state law blesses the idea of people living in different places being parts of different school districts. And I would just note, like, Hawaii doesn't have that. Hawaii has one school district, a statewide school district. And so one state law is that there are boundaries between school districts. And we kind of take that for granted that there are boundaries between school districts, but let's acknowledge that that is a state law. And so where to draw the boundaries was done by the state. That there are boundaries in the first place was done by the state. And then connecting where a student goes to school to where they live is also a state policy. So there's a bunch of education related laws that exist that create that dynamic. Okay, but there's another step here, which is that how might laws connect where people live, right? So that's what you have to identify here. Heather, do you have a thought on that?
I just have a question about the de facto versus, I think it's de jure segregation. So this is a state thing, right? Because I came from New Jersey where de facto segregation is unconstitutional. So I don't know, I know this isn't a federal case.
Yeah.
But how can some states make de facto segregation unconstitutional if it's not explicit, like in the case that we're reading?
So New Jersey, for example, could interpret their own equal protection clause in such a way that the violation of the New Jersey Constitution can happen not just from explicit segregation or segregation by law, but also from policies that result in segregation. And so that would be the difference between de jure and de facto. De jure meaning we're explicitly separating people, de facto meaning, for whatever reason, people end up being separated. And so different states have their own constitutions and their own interpretation of their own, essentially, equivalent of the Equal Protection Clause. Is that making sense?
I guess my question was more like, I forgot who said something about geography being one of the many ways that de facto segregation is kind of like a thing, like white flight, all that. How do you control something? Like, I know we're not in New Jersey. It was just interesting to me to know that, like, how do you control, like, where people move?
Well, that's the question. That's kind of what I'm asking. Can you control where people move? Like, what laws, and maybe Sarah, this is what your hand's up for, what laws control how people move or where people move?
Yeah, so like thinking about like redlining and housing policies and zoning policies that restrict what kinds of, like, is it a single family house and we're not allowing like apartment complexes to be zoned and those types of things, because these cases later on, especially with Jenkins, talks about, it goes back to this onus of personal choice, and then it's like, it's just choice. People are choosing to live in these places. But looking back historically, there's still the legal ramifications of the past of housing policies and where people could put themselves. It wasn't always about just, I can choose to live wherever I want to.
Right. So zoning is a huge one, right? So if you want to ensure that you have a certain type of resident in your community, then you can do that through your zoning laws. If another way would be, and this is something that is kind of beyond the scope of our class, but Sarah's kind of talking about it, redlining. Redlining is about determining which neighborhoods get subsidies in terms of like mortgages, and which applicants get subsidies for mortgages for which neighborhoods. And so there's explicit, through this period, there's explicit federal policy that is making determinations about who can move to the suburbs. And so it's not just that people wanted or didn't want to move to the suburbs, it's that you know, I don't think I'm overstating it here. White people were subsidized to move to the suburbs, and Black people were prohibited from moving to the suburbs. Not prohibited from moving to the suburbs. They were not subsidized, right? So it was a lot cheaper for a white person to move to the suburbs than a Black person to move to the suburbs. That was because of the way that subsidies were being distributed at this particular time. So there's the education laws, but there's also housing laws. And so, you know, when people say de facto segregation, there's a whole movement that says there's no such thing as de facto segregation, that in fact all segregation, even those made based on individual choices, those individual choices are incentivized or impacted by the way, like zoning, or subsidizing mortgages or subsidizing construction. Like, for example, there's communities that are built with a federal subsidy for construction, but the you know, the condition for building, for taking the federal subsidy was that you had to have racially restrictive covenants in the whole development. So a racially restrictive covenant, you know, like, I know that y'all don't want to think about, you know, if you've wiped out con law, I know you've wiped out property, but a restrictive covenant is like, you know, a covenant that says that this plot cannot be sold to, and then there's a list of, you know, certain identities that it can't be sold to preserve, you know, they would say that it was to preserve the value of the homes in the neighborhood. But the effect was that it would preserve the racial makeup of the residents in the neighborhood, and that the federal government is essentially subsidizing the construction of those homes and mandating the inclusion of those restrictive covenants. And this is happening even after restrictive covenants have been found to be unenforceable. So there's a lot of law that leads to residential segregation. And so if geography matters for which school district you go to, and law creates a situation in which where you live is going to be determined in a lot of ways by race, then it's hard to call what happened in Detroit completely de facto. Absolutely, there are individual choices involved. It just happened, but those individual choices were hugely influenced by policy. So I'm going to transition us into Jenkins because I do want to get us through it, okay? But before I do, I want to sort of summarize. So we have a situation that says absent an interdistrict constitutional violation, then a metropolitan remedy is not appropriate. That's Milliken. Absent an interdistrict violation, an across-district violation. So Rachel, this is going to your point, to the point you're asking. Absent that, then there's no metropolitan remedy. There's no metropolitan desegregation. And so therefore, the mere fact that you have a racially identifiable school district here and an opposite racially identifiable school district right next to it, that's okay under the Constitution. That is not inherently a problem, okay, under the Constitution. And so the result from that, you know, I guess I'll just put this to you guys. If that's the case, right, if across district racial identifiability is not a problem, and you still live in Detroit and you don't want desegregation to happen to your family and you're white, what are you going to do? What does Milliken encourage you to do? Darius, I don't know if I saw your hand pop up. I don't know if you meant to do it to answer this question. No. What is the family going to do after Milliken?
They're
Yeah,
going to
Taylor?
move out of Detroit, I'm guessing.
Taylor?
Yeah, I was just gonna say then you would move out of that area.
Because now you know that if you move out of Detroit, if that's what you want, and you know now that that's going to be sort of insulate you from desegregation, well, then you're all the more incentivized to move. So the effect of Milliken in northern, in particular, metro areas, because those are where you have these splintered school districts, more often is an increase in white flight. White flight existed before Milliken and before Swan. It was happening already, but Milliken is an accelerator of white flight. Okay, and so that's what happens. And so 20 years pass, and places like Kansas City look like they do, and we have a situation in which the court is confronting a somewhat similar but different problem, right? So here, we don't have the option to have a metropolitan school desegregation plan. So what the school district and the district court do in Kansas City is to say, okay, well, we can't confront separation anymore. And in fact, we can have separation across district lines. That's not a constitutional problem. So separation is okay. Well, at least let's confront some of the vestiges of state-sponsored segregation. We can't do integration anymore because this district is now 70% African-American. And so even though the metro area is not 70% African-American. And so what they say is, well, let's turn to equality, right? Remember way back at the beginning, what were we talking about? We weren't talking about people necessarily being in schools together, although maybe that was a means to an end. The end was better educational opportunities. And so what they look at in Kansas City and say, if you have removed the possibility of students being in schools together, which is essentially by the 90s what has happened, that unless that's happening voluntarily, it's very difficult for a court to force people to sit with Mr. McLaurin. So if people do voluntarily, great, but the courts can't force it. And so what they say is, well, if we can't force that, maybe we should at least force educational equity or equality. And the words that they use in Jenkins are suburban comparability. We want this district, which is serving a predominantly African-American student population, to be comparable to these other districts, right? So Kansas City has the same basic, I didn't get a map of Kansas City, but it's the same basic setup. You have a central city district that's serving a predominantly African-American population surrounded by several, not quite as many, predominantly white suburban districts, okay? And what they're saying is, we are just gonna focus resources in as part of the desegregation plan. That's the idea in Jenkins. So just real quick, what is the vestige that they're shooting for, that they're aiming at when it comes to Missouri versus Jenkins? They say, you're right, if Swan says eliminate the vestiges of state-sponsored segregation, yeah, Darius?
I would just think it goes back to like test scores and opportunity after that. Further, if you can't excel in education, you won't make it too far and get an opportunity afterwards.
Right.
So.
Right. We kind of listed that, right? We said, what is one of the vestiges? Disparities in student performance, student achievement. And so they say, well, we still have that. That's a vestige. And so we need to confront it. And so we're going to focus all these resources into the Kansas City school district. Depressed academic performance, I think, is the way they frame it. And so I want to make a note here that when they're talking about test scores, Darius, you mentioned test scores, and the court talks about performance test scores. Would that be properly characterized as an output of education or an input to education? Okay, I don't think I've used this phrasing yet, outputs versus inputs. What are test scores, outputs or inputs?
Are you asking me or anybody?
Sure. I'm asking anybody, but now you're talking, so I'm asking you.
I think it's all about perspective, but you can say what's put in is reflective of what, and what comes out. If you don't have the funding, the appropriate funding, I guess, for good teachers and books and et cetera, then, what happens on the paper and you get the 40 out of 200 points, you don't know, you can point at the student or you can point at everything else too.
So I'm not saying where do I point, I'm saying what am I looking at, right? So you said teachers, resources, those would be inputs or outputs?
Those would be inputs.
Those would be inputs, and then the 40 would
That'd
be
be
an
the
input.
output.
That'd be an output, okay?
Mhm.
And so what they're talking about here in Jenkins is they're using all of these inputs, right? Which are explicitly unequal, right? The district has magnet schools. It's, I don't know, it kind of rubs me the wrong way every time I read about it. They list all these things, you know, with the, you know, like every classroom has microscopes and all, you know, like it kind of sounds like a good thing to me. They talk about it like it's they're doing something wrong, that they have all these good things in the schools. And so there's like a planetarium or something. That sounds to me like that's good. But it's definitely unequal to the suburban districts. There's a lot of inputs being put in. And in fact, part of the problem in the Jenkins case is that it's financially unsustainable. Like there's no, the district court is ordering all these things, and it's forcing the state of Missouri to fund it, you know, to fund this as a remedy to continued depressed academic performance. And there's no concept that if the court wasn't ordering this, that Missouri could afford it. And in fact, they're already not able to afford it. It's hugely unequal inputs, okay? But the outputs are also unequal, but they're unequal in a different way, right? The outputs in the Kansas City district are lower than national norms. That's the phrasing that they're using. And so here they're talking about performance and outputs as being the measure of effectiveness. And this is really, really radical. So if we go back to our McLaurin situation, they're saying, look, we can't force people to sit with McLaurin, but we are going to force the University of Oklahoma to create a situation in which McLaurin scores at national norms, okay? And it doesn't make as much sense when you're here where you're, you know, identifying it on one person. But they're basically saying until there is effectiveness on the outputs, then the vestige hasn't been fixed. Does that make sense? And this is really radical. So let me ask you guys, why, right? So instead of this, Jenkins, up until the time it gets to the court, is talking about performance and outputs. And in order to get to those outputs, as Darius has said, you affect the inputs, right? Magnet schools, low teacher-student ratios, planetariums, whatever. Okay, and the goal is national norms, performance at national norms. And what they're not focusing on is saying, oh, well, as long as there's equal opportunity, or there's equal inputs, or there's equal access. They're saying that's not enough. Equal access, equal opportunity, equal inputs, that's insufficient. What we're needing is outputs, equal performance, equal test scores, performing at national norms. Why is that hard? What's the problem with that? Just from a, you know, just like we ask it with Millikan. What's the problem when you expand beyond one school district to a metro area? We had that conversation. What's the problem when you switch from equal opportunity to do well to equal performance? Why is that either harder to achieve or what? I would argue it's actually easier to measure. Yeah, Taylor.
Well, I was thinking when you measure performance, you don't take into account each student. So like if someone has a learning disability, that kind of stuff, when you're measuring the output, whereas if you're looking at everything that's getting put in. But
Right.
then you said you thought it was easier, so then I was second guessing.
Well, it's easier to measure whether, if we just reduce everything to test scores, it's easier to say like, okay, I don't know whether the opportunities are equal or the access is equal, but I'm looking and the performance is not equal, right? So that's what I mean when I say it's easier to measure. What I think is implicit, Taylor, in what you're saying is it's maybe harder, if not impossible, to achieve. right? And why? Why would it be so difficult to achieve, let's say, equal outputs?
Well, because every student's different. Everyone learns different. Everyone tests different. Everyone has different brains and different things going on. So you have no idea to know specifically like what's actually happening for each student.
Great. So what are the variables that are involved in determining an output? Darius talked about the inputs. What else is a variable, Taylor?
I mean, the learning disability, environment. I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, the students themselves, right? Like you guys are all looking at the same class. You're taking the same class, but your performance is not going to be the same. Y'all are all different, right? I've got 40 people in here right now, and all 40 of you are learning in different ways. You come with different experiences. You come with different talents and skills. You come with different levels of effort, you know, like if I'm being frank here. And so like that factors into your performance. And are those things controllable by the school or the court? No, probably not. I see a bunch of head shaking. No. Okay, so it's tricky. When you, what Jenkins is calling for sounds awesome. Okay, it sounds awesome. We want to do, it's calling for an effective remedy to racial achievement gaps. That's what it's calling for. Okay, and tying that into desegregation. And I think that if you were to go back to the 1930s and 40s and ask the lawyers that are building the case that eventually becomes Brown versus Board of Education, what would you want if you had to choose? Would you want an effective equalization of performance and an elimination of racial achievement gaps on one hand, or would you want a bunch of students of different races in schools together? I'm not sure which they would pick, but I think they would be remiss or it would be very hard for them to say, no, we don't want that. We don't want equal educational performance. Forget opportunities, performance. We want a world in which your performance is not correlated to race. That's what Kansas City is saying, or that's what the court is pushing Kansas City to shoot for. And that until you've reached that, you haven't remedied the problem. Okay? Of course, the court says no. Okay? The court says no again. And so they say no for a lot of the same reasons as we saw in Milliken. Local control is part of this as well. And note that in the 20 years between Milliken and Jenkins, there's a new phrase that has been written into the vestiges statement, right? So in Swan, it's eliminate all the vestiges. By the time of Jenkins, it's no longer eliminate all the vestiges. It's eliminate all the vestiges to the extent practicable, okay? And so what we've seen in that 2 decades is at some point the Supreme Court started backing off, right? Milliken was the first step in the backing off, and we skipped a bunch of other cases, but there are cases in which they're tiptoeing towards this to the extent practicable. And so no longer is it eliminate all the vestiges, it's eliminate all the vestiges as much as you can. And so that standard is a lot different. And the court says they've done it in Kansas City. Like it doesn't go on forever. And therefore now is the time for, you know, and I think Justice Thomas says to put the genie back in the bottle, right? This has gone on long enough and it's time to sort of stop this pouring everything into these school desegregation suits, okay? And they're talking also about the causal link between why is the performance still disparate, why are there racially disproportionate performances? Can you really tie that, right? They say there has to be a real connection between state-sponsored segregation. It can't just be like there was state-sponsored segregation and now there's racial disparities in performance and therefore it must be connected. There must be an actual causal chain that connects those two things, the court says. And so the result we get is that after Milliken efforts sort of to go beyond school district lines to create integration are no longer allowed to be forced, right? They can still be done voluntarily. And after Jenkins, it's okay for inequalities in performance to continue to exist across district lines as well. And so when I say that we've completed the circle, what I mean is if Plessy said that the law allows for separation so long as there's inequality, racial separation as long as there's equality, and we know that that was tolerated even where there was inequality, we actually might, after Jenkins, be in a worse situation where not only is it okay to have separation across district lines, or as Justice Marshall says, fences that are dividing up our metropolitan areas and that are very much connected to race. It's okay to have those fences. And after Jenkins, it's actually okay for the performance to be unequal on either side of those fences, those fence lines. And so there's this whole interesting post-Jenkins discussion about, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit on Friday. The argument in a nutshell is, could we at least get Plessy, right? Where Plessy mandated equality. Jenkins says equality is not even a goal here. It's okay to be unequal across district lines. Okay, so I'm going to stop. I feel like we got through it. Maybe felt a little bit rushed. There's plenty more to unpack with this. So I'm going to give some thought to what we should do on Friday, whether we should take the day as like a just sort of let's sit with this case study and take a breath and then move next week in a new direction, or whether, I'm going to think about it. So be watching the Twin page for the assignments, and I will put them up as soon as I can. All right. See you guys on Friday.
Professor Keel,
Yes.
what time on Friday is the paper due? By class, or is there a different time?
By the end of the day.
Okay.
I think, midnight is fine. I'm not going to look at them on Friday.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Keel, I've got a question about the Milliken case.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm stuck on just the remedy of the court. So they're saying that, it's got to be in between districts. It's got to, like you said, it's got to be like they've all got to be segregating students for there to be a remedy that matches this. But they were just busing students to these other districts. So what was it hurting? Like, what was this remedy hurting anyone?
What was it hurting?
Because if they were just busing students back and forth through these districts, why weren't they even going to allow that? Even though not every district was like racist or, having a problem, what was the busing hurting? Like, I just don't understand why the district court couldn't order that.
Why they did or didn't?
Did not order that.
The district court did order that.
I'm sorry. Why the Supreme Court?
Why the Supreme Court says no, they can't do that.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding. You're saying, why did the Supreme Court, like, are you almost asking, like, what's the harm?
Yeah, what's the harm? Yeah, what's the harm?
That kind of remedy?
Yeah.
So the suburban districts intervened in the lawsuit, and they were making some of the arguments that were articulated in class today, that it was a removal of their autonomy to have their students taken to another district and to have students from another district brought in to their district. And so they were to the suburban districts. And so they were arguing that it was a removal of their authority and autonomy that was not merited. That, they're largely making what I would call a liberty argument, that we have the authority to do what we want in our school district, and unless we have been found to violate the Constitution, you can't tell us otherwise. And we haven't been found to violate the Constitution, and so you can't force us into this remedy just because we're neighbors to a constitutional violator. And so they are the ones that are advocating against this interdistrict busing plan.
So technically, you could never have an odd number of districts doing this because you would have to have another district to match it. So you could always have like 2 or 4 or 6 districts interchanging students.
Maybe. I mean, they didn't have to be done the way that I described it in Detroit. It could have been, like if the student populations the numbers were such that you might have been able to pair 2 suburban districts with 1 neighborhood in Detroit or something like that.
Okay.
So it could have, the truth is, like I'm always saying, like people will be saying like, you can't do this and you can't do that. And I'm always saying you can do whatever, like if you have the power and the will to do it, then you can do pretty much anything. You can force students to go to public schools. You can force students to go to integrated schools. You can force whatever, like if you have the power and the will to do it, then you can do it. I don't think there's a lot of will for these kinds of metropolitan desegregation programs today. I don't think there was much will for it in 1974, but I think there's virtually zero will for it now.
Okay.
Let me rephrase that. There's zero will for it from the suburban constituents. There is some will for it, I think, within cities.
Okay. Okay. Yes, I'm just a constitutional issue. It's kind of confusing me now that we're to this stage. So thank you.
Okay. Well, keep asking. Darius, your hand's up. Everybody else there's other people still hanging out. I don't know, you guys just hanging out. Alex, good to see you.
I just wanted to get questions.
Okay.
I have a question about the response paper, like about what I wanted to write about, but if they have other questions about class, I'll wait.
Okay. Go ahead, Darius.
All right. So my question is this: why wasn't the strategy used in Brown? Why wasn't that like used in Michigan? Like you talk about Topeka and the other, I think Virginia, another location or 2. Like the strategy of pulling from there, like the problems. Why wasn't that used?
Hold on 1 second. I have to stop my dog. He's eating something.
Take your time.
That's not for you. Got it. He was eating the guinea pig's vitamin C tablets.
Should have asked him if it tastes good. No,
yeah. I don't think dogs make that distinction.
But my question was like, why wasn't like that same strategy of like we need more people to advocate for this or see the same injury occur in these other districts before we decide to step to the Supreme Court or district court about the matter? Why didn't they approach it that way? Like it kind of like you always ask about tools. Like we learned the tool used in Brown. Why didn't they go use the same tool in that case?
So you mean to have multiple
districts
versions of this case come up simultaneously?
Yeah, that same strategy.
That's a good question. I think it's in part the answer is that the litigants were litigating this in lots of different places. It was just that they were never consolidated in the same, and I don't know the answer to your question, why they were never consolidated in the same way in Milliken as they were in the Brown situation. So I'll give you 2 just quick side stories that demonstrate that the litigation was happening simultaneously in lots of different places. So Swan is a Charlotte case about busing, but the year before Swan was decided by the Supreme Court, the Memphis deseg case went to the Supreme Court. And in that case, Justice Marshall had to recuse himself because he had represented the NAAC, the Memphis plaintiffs, earlier in their litigation. And so he was recused. So they had an 8-person Supreme Court, and they didn't want to consider the busing. So, they were pushing for busing in Memphis before Swan. And the court, sort of said, well, this is we only have 8 justices here, so we don't want to make a decision of this magnitude without Justice Marshall and with an 8-person court, an even-numbered court. And so they kind of punted the Memphis case. But it could have been a situation that the Memphis case and the Charlotte case were consolidated into a single case, and they would have had both of those before them. So that's one story to demonstrate that they actually are litigating lots of different things at the same time. It's just that when they get to the Supreme Court, it's not consolidated in the same manner. And I don't know that I think that was the Supreme Court that did the consolidating, not the litigants themselves. So the Supreme Court didn't consolidate. The other part of the story is in Louisville at the same time. So this is maybe getting too in the weeds, but Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee are the 6th Circuit, the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals, and Louisville. So Louisville is also in the 6th Circuit. Also had a situation at this time where they had multiple school districts, and the district court ordered consolidation of the school districts so that there would no longer be just a Louisville district and these suburban districts, but rather said, we're just going to consolidate the school districts in this county and make the desegregation plan. And that was happening at the same time as Milliken, both within the 6th Circuit. And so the 6th Circuit was at this time like a hotbed of these kinds of cases. And it seems plausible that the Louisville case could have been appealed to the Supreme Court simultaneous with the Milliken case, and they could have been consolidated too, but weren't. So that's a long way of saying I don't know why it didn't happen. It might have been interesting if it had, to have multiple places as opposed to just one, just Detroit.
All right. Thank you, though.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to make sure that the only thing that I really need to do is watch class and then the paper.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think you're good.
I am feeling much better.
Good. I hope you're not seeing anybody.
She hasn't since Corona, but before.
Uh-oh.
Well, today's technically my last day of isolation, so just my husband who also has it, so
Yeah.
it's great.
But don't worry, I'm negative.
Yeah, I quite a few people got it, unfortunately. Taylor was not one of them. But okay, I just wanted to make sure that was it.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Okay. The paper, I feel like I don't know. I feel like this is gonna be bad. I feel like it's weird, but I was thinking of it almost in sense of like looking at an alternative. Have you ever